Welcome to a high-stakes Armageddon clash between two titans, Fabiano Caruana and Alireza Firouzja. With everything on the line, the clock is ticking and the pressure is immense. Fabi opens with pawn to e4, and Alireza answers with the super-solid Caro-Kann defense, pushing pawns to c6 and d5, setting up a classic battle for the center. White plays pawn to f3, and this is an early inaccuracy. It weakens the king's position slightly and gives up the opening advantage. The much stronger idea was to immediately push the pawn to e5, grabbing a huge chunk of central space. But Alireza misses his chance. He plays pawn to g6, preparing to fianchetto his bishop, but this fails to punish White's last move. The correct response was to immediately challenge the center by taking the pawn on e4, which would have given Black a clear edge. White now seizes the chance to build a powerful pawn center with e5 and f4. Black develops and immediately starts chipping away at it, capturing on d4, and White's queen recaptures. The pieces continue to fly out. Knight to f3 for White, knight to c6 for Black, and a pin arrives with bishop to b5. And here comes the fireworks. Alireza plays the brilliant knight to h6. This is a fantastic sacrifice looking to shatter White's queenside pawn structure after the bishop is forced to capture. Caruana doesn't hesitate. Bishop takes the knight on c6, with check, and the follow-up is perfect. The pawn takes back on c6. This is the only move. It keeps the position dynamic and fully justifies the knight sacrifice. A tense and complex middle game unfolds. The queen shuffles to c5. Bishops and knights jockey for position, and both sides probe for weaknesses as Black's knight leaps to f5. Fabi's queen drops back to c3, and Black immediately challenges White's control with the pawn push to c5. What a find from Caruana. Knight takes the pawn on c5. This is the only move that keeps White firmly in the driver's seat, a fantastic piece of calculation. With this central tension resolved for now, both kings find safety by castling. Rooks and bishops are repositioned as the players prepare for the next phase of the battle. White begins to expand on the queen side by pushing the b-pawn, while Black brings a rook over to the c-file to increase the pressure. White plays queen to d2, an inaccuracy. It's a solid developing move, but he missed a stronger idea. Immediately pushing the pawn to a5 would have created much more significant problems for Black. And Alireza returns the favor. Bishop to e8 is a quiet move, but it also misses the exact same idea. Pushing his own pawn to a5 was the way to generate counterplay and keep White on his toes. White now consolidates, tucking the king away on h2, and begins a dangerous kingside expansion with the pawn marching up to g4, putting the question to Black's knight. A flurry of trades erupts. Pawns are exchanged on the queen side, and then Black strikes in the center with pawn to d4, which White calmly meets by capturing with the bishop. Black's rook swings to d8, but this is a slip in a tricky position. Much better was to trade pieces with bishop takes the knight on c5, simplifying and easing some of the pressure. And Caruana pounces. The knight leaps into the beautiful central outpost on e4, and the pressure on Black's position is mounting. Under immense pressure, Alireza errs again with bishop to c6. This allows White's attack to grow even stronger. The best defensive try was queen to b7, looking for counterplay on the queen side. White brings the final rook into the game and then uncorks the powerful knight check on f6, forcing the Black king to the corner on h8. With Black's king in the corner, Fabi has a chance to ramp up the pressure. He plays pawn to f5, a good move, but he missed a killer blow. The knight could have jumped to g5, posing immediate threats. After bishop takes the pawn on a4, queen to g2 prepares a decisive attack. Black can try rook to b8, but White just brings the other rook to c8 and the position is overwhelming. But in the game, the pawn pushes to f5 and Black gets a moment to breathe. And Alireza uses that moment wisely, bringing his knight back to e8 to help defend the beleaguered king. White captures pawn takes pawn on g6, but this is another inaccuracy. The strongest move by far was to eliminate that key defender with knight takes the knight on e8. That would have kept the attack rolling, and now, chaos on the board. Black takes the knight on f3, and then a series of pawn captures completely blows open the kingside, exposing both monarchs. Black's bishop drops back to g7, a defensive error. The critical idea was to create counterplay with rook takes the pawn on a4, forcing White to respond to threats on the other side of the board, and Caruana unleashes a thunderbolt, queen to f4. A brilliant move, sacrificing material to launch a decisive winning attack against the exposed Black king. Absolutely stunning. Black has no choice, the rook is forced to take the bishop on d4, and the recapture is perfect. Queen takes the rook on d4. This is the only move, and it keeps the winning attack alive and kicking. Black tries to block with bishop to h6, but white's queen simply swings over to h4, staring directly at the enemy king. In a desperate situation, Alireza plays queen to g7, but it's an inaccuracy in a position that is already falling apart. White brings the rook to f1, which is a good move, but believe it or not, it's an inaccuracy. A slightly different move order would have secured the win even more quickly. And another error from black under pressure. Bishop to e2 is played, but the better defensive try was bishop to c6 to challenge white's pieces. Caruana improves his rook's position, lifting it to f2, preparing to join the attack. Black's bishop moves to d3, and this is a decisive mistake. This move walks right into a beautiful winning combination for white, and here it is. Knight jumps to g4, initiating the final assault. Black's bishop desperately takes the pawn on g6, but white's knight simply takes the bishop on h6, and black's defensive structure is in ruins. Alireza throws in a desperate check, queen takes the pawn on e5, but this doesn't change anything. The best try was to grab the a4 pawn with the rook, though the game was already lost. White easily blocks the check with the rook to g3, and black's queen is forced to retreat to h5. And here, in a completely winning position, a shocking mistake from Caruana. He's about to throw away the win. Rook to f8, check king to h7, queen to e7, check knight to g7, knight to g4. But instead of all that, Fabi plays, queen takes the queen on h5, trading off the most powerful attacking piece and letting black right back into the game. And Firouzja finds the only move. The bishop recaptures on h5. This is a great find that keeps the game alive and suddenly gives black real chances. White immediately gives a check with the rook on f8, and the black king steps away to h7. But Caruana is not done. He finds another brilliant sacrifice. Knight to f7, unbelievable. This move reignites the attack and puts white right back on the path to victory. Now, what does black do? He takes the knight with his bishop, but this is an inaccuracy that loses on the spot. Bishop to g6, knight to g5, check king to h6, knight takes pawn on e6, rook takes pawn on a4. Back in the real game, the bishop takes the knight on f7, and that will be the final mistake. And the follow-up is crushing. Rook takes the bishop on f7 with check. This is the only move, and it's a decisive one. The king is forced to h6, and white's rook takes up the dominant post on f8, sealing the king's fate. Black's king shuffles back to h7, but this is the final slip. The last chance was to bring the knight into the game with knight to c7. White has a completely won position, and he plays rook to g8. This move still wins, but it's technically a mistake. Rook to f4, knight to g7, rook to f7, king to h8, rook takes knight on g7. In the game, though, the rook goes to g8, and while it's not the most precise, the result is no longer in doubt. And after a breathtaking, complex battle, full of brilliant sacrifices and shocking mistakes from both sides, Fabiano Caruana secures the victory. What an incredible game.